Welcome to Instruction Discussion, our weekly look at the latest topics and trends in education affecting schools here on Long Island and schools around the world. Whether you're a teacher, parent, or student, listen for tips and strategies to help you navigate the educational landscape. There's a bell. It's time to start today's Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hello, I'm Kevin Boston Hill, and welcome to Instruction Discussion, where each week we will examine a recent trend or development in education and its impact on Long Island. When we think about the early years of our country, including the Revolutionary era, we tend to think of the major battles like Lexington Concord or Bunker Hill, or major players like Washington, Jefferson, and Hamilton. While these events and names are clearly vital to the nation's development, there are other lesser-known events and people that make important contributions as well. New York was a major hub of activity during this time, and historians will mention battles in Saratoga and Manhattan, or people such as Nathan Hale. Almost forgotten in this discussion is the evidence of slavery in the New York area and the relationships that developed between slave and slave owner. One such relationship was between a young slave girl, Liss, and the family that she worked for, the Townsends of Oyster Bay. The Townsends' son, Robert, became a spy for General Washington, and the home became headquarters for a British commander and abolitionist. This account is documented in the book Remember Liss, the remarkable true story of one woman's enslavement and freedom in New York, by Claire Bellerjeau and Tiffany Yecke Brooks. We welcome one of the authors, Claire Bellerjeau, to further discuss the relationship between the Townsend family and Liss, as well as how they are juxtaposed with the larger event, the Revolutionary War and the fight for freedom. Ms. Bellerjeau, welcome to Instruction Discussion on 90.3 WHPC.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here with you and to introduce your audience to this amazing woman named Liss.
Yeah, I think they will definitely get a lot out of being introduced to this person the same way that I was when I first met you and was able to dive into the book that you wrote as well. So, let's go ahead and get right into this discussion. And what was it that actually prompted you to write this book? It's
been a pretty long research journey. I actually first discovered the existence of Liss 18 years ago.
Wow.
I was living in Oyster Bay, which is the town where she was once enslaved, and I had become involved with a house museum called Raynham Hall Museum. Now, at the time when I first started working there, usually just on the weekends, they didn't interpret anything about slavery at that site. They were strictly telling the story of the white Townsend family. And in many ways, they were skirting the idea of slavery by purporting that the family were Quakers, which they actually were not. But, they had an exciting story to tell, as you said. The son, Robert, had been a spy for Washington. The father was a major patriot leader in New York. And then the household itself became a headquarters in the village. So one after another, British commanders were billeting there.
Got it. It just goes to show that history is pretty much told from the eye of the beholder. It's just that whatever version that they come up with is what's going to be written down and recorded and passed on throughout all of time to think about. So it's almost like except for thanks to you, that this whole family was almost forgotten. Like we almost forgotten Liss as just opposite of what your book title is.
It turned out after my research that there were twice as many Black enslaved people in this household as the white family. It was a family of 10 enslaving at least 20 Black people. This flies in the face of the normal idea of what Northern slavery is, at least what I was told growing up, which was that slavery happened in the South. And if it happened in the North, it was very few people who were enslaved, and they were treated really well, like family, and it really wasn't a lot. And then here came this research as I started following these breadcrumbs, and I realized this is just a complete whitewashing of the history of New York.
Yeah.
And it all began because a descendant of that Townsend family took this item that had been passed down by generation after generation after generation, never mentioned, and he decided to sell it at auction. one of the big auction houses in Manhattan, Swan Galleries. And so, of course, the gallery owners want to sell it for a lot. So they reach out to possible buyers. And the museum was a great possibility because this item was a Bible that they would end up purchasing for $10,000. And it wasn't the verses that were important. It was handwriting that was on the outside pages, the end papers. And these handwritten words were the names of enslaved people. Right. Not just their names, too, like dates of their birth, a few instances of dates of their death, and their relationships to each other, mothers, daughters, fathers and sons, husbands and wives. And it was like a whole universe caught up in these little end papers that had been completely forgotten.
Well, it's because I think all throughout history and in different cultures and communities, you can easily see that it was the Bibles that held a lot of that, I guess, that family tree lineage that would be handed down from family to generation. So I think even in my own household, I can go back to a particular family Bible and trace my lineage back a few generations just because we recorded all the names of people in that Bible. So it's almost no wonder that it would actually have that level of importance today.
It seems that way on the surface, but everything in Liss's story requires deeper examination. Of course. What I found over the years as I really tried to get to the bottom of this Bible record, first of all, it was all written by one person, and it was all written at one time. You can tell by the way the ink appears and by the handwriting that it wasn't a typical Bible where time passes in between things happening and different people write down with different kinds of handwriting. This Bible record was all written at once, and I could tell because the latest date was 1795 that it had been written after the father of the household had been dead for 5 years. This Bible was written at the time when Robert Townsend, the spy, was in charge of the family's estate. Robert, in his later life, ended up believing that slavery was morally wrong, and he joined a New York anti-slavery group that was formed by John Jay, with Alexander Hamilton and Hercules Mulligan in the group. And I believe that this Bible record was actually a way that Robert was creating a record of ownership that showed the ages of enslaved people in his father's estate. Because in this time period, you could not be free unless you were old enough, but not too old. So you had to prove that you owned a slave to free them. That was actually very hard because there were very few documents of their birth or of their ownership if they were born in your household. So I believe that Robert created these records in this Bible so that he would have a way of freeing individuals. And actually, Liss wasn't even listed in there. Yeah, it was subsequent research that led to my discovery of her. Yeah.
Right. And I think that it was, and not trying to give too much away in the book, in the journey, but at some point, Liss was actually sold off or even captured off into the South and sold into slavery there. And then Robert had to go back and find her and bring her back to New York. But I guess let's talk a little bit about Liss then, since I know we're getting into this. Why is she so important to this story, and why Liss? Because I'm sure that there were hundreds of other African American slaves during this time that.
Not just hundreds. I mean, there were
literally thousands.
It was 16% of the population of Oyster Bay. But in Manhattan, it was more like 25% of the population were Black enslaved people. And so that is the core of why her story is so important. First of all, it's very memorable. She actually crosses paths with George Washington, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, the Culper Spiring, the Benedict Arnold treason plot, and all these anchors to American history. But somehow the evidence in documents of her life exists to this day. And that is what makes her a founding figure, because she can represent the lives of so many other people whose stories are not documented. It doesn't mean they didn't live. It doesn't mean they weren't important. But Liss really is a standout I can't think of another woman of color from New York of this time period that we have such a rich story about that can be proven through documents. So she is sort of like Anne Frank became a representative of the Holocaust experience. Liss can be recognized as that kind of figure, but during the founding era.
Yeah, I think because when you think about especially Black women having a prominent role in early history, you're really going to go towards the Civil War era when you think of Phyllis Wheatley and the like, and Harriet Tubman and the like, Sojourner Truth. But you don't hear too much about Black women during the Revolutionary era. As a matter of fact, really the only Black person that you hear about is Crispus Attucks. And
Crispus Attucks actually was right beside a man who would play such a huge role in Liss's story. It's hard to even believe, but you can see on the cover of the book, if you get it, the famous image of the Boston Massacre. There's Crispus, the first person to die in the fight for America, being a man of color. And then right beside him, you'll see a man with like a baseball bat, a club raised high. Yep. There's several versions of this artwork, and he's always right in the middle of the picture. He was the man who enslaved her in Charleston many years later, just by coincidence.
Just by coincidence. It's amazing how these things kind of link together with one another. And that image that I'm sure everybody has seen, I think was actually etched by Paul Revere. That came up with the most famous image that we remember seeing and everything.
The one that I feature isn't one of the Revere ones. It's a later one. Okay. But, I mean, they're all just really incredibly iconic.
Yep.
And so, when you look at famous artwork of the Revolutionary War or of the founding era, you really can't find people of color pictured other than Crispus. They might be way in the background as a servant, but you don't get to see them up front, generally speaking. It's wonderful that Phyllis Wheatley actually did have an image drawn of her, because she actually did live closer to Liss's time period than the Civil War era.
Right, okay.
But what a lot of New Yorkers don't realize is that Phyllis Wheatley wasn't the first published Black author in America. It actually was a Long Islander, an enslaved man named Jupiter Hammond from Lloyd's Neck. And he comes into Liss's story, too. Actually, one of the daughters of the Townsend household made her own copy of an unpublished Jupiter Hammond poem that I discovered during my research. Well, so there's so many rabbit holes you can go down.
I see. This is actually starting to sound very Forrest Gumpish as far as just being in the right place at the right time around the right people and just happened to be there. But now this was her life. This was her journey.
It's so funny that you say that, because my co-author, Tiffany, and I, that's the phrase we always use. Forrest Gump. How can this be happening again, that another famous figure or famous moment is crossing paths with her? But it's such a blessing because, people need those memorable cues. And so, sure, Liss didn't invent anything. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't a politician. But she can be this founding figure for New Yorkers, certainly, and I think for all Americans. So she was enslaved as the war began. She was a teenager. And as I said, British officers were billeting in the house where she was in Oyster Bay, but one of them really made a difference. It was a man named Colonel John Graves Simcoe. And if your listeners watched the show Turn, that show completely misrepresented this man. They made him into a villain. But in fact, the family said of all of the commanders that billeted in the house, he was the most honorable.
Yeah, didn't he become an abolitionist as well?
He certainly did. Yeah. He believed that slavery was morally wrong during the war. He actually helped Liss escape in May of 1779. And I found 2 other instances of him helping enslaved people escape during the war. Then after the war, he became the governor of Upper Canada. He founded Toronto. But the most notable thing he did was end slavery by law in Canada. Because during Liss's era, it was legal the whole time in Canada. You could not escape to Canada in her time. So he really made a destination for the Underground Railroad of the Civil War era. And again, happenstance that they would encounter one another. But he helped her escape, only for her to be re-enslaved in Manhattan, just as Robert became lead spy for the Culper spy ring. And one of the other spies mentions a woman who has joined the group, calling her by a code number 355. He says a lady of his acquaintance has a special ability that she will help the spies outwit the British. Now, we'll probably never know who 355 is, but I want to lift Liss up to be in the very top of that list. Because as an enslaved woman, she did have a legitimate way to outwit them.
Yeah.
By being invisible, essentially.
You are listening to Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Kevin Boston Hill, and our guest today is Claire Bellerjeau, co-author along with Tiffany Yecke Brooks of the book Remember Liss, the remarkable true story of one woman's enslavement and freedom in New York. We started just a little bit talking about her journey, but I want to talk about how has Liss's journey in slavery almost mirrored the nation's fight for freedom.
You know, how do you handle being enslaved, having no rights, in full knowledge that all around you, people are fighting for freedom? And how are enslaved Black people encountering this war? Well, it turns out that the British promised escaped American slaves their freedom if they would come over and fight for the British cause. But there was a caveat. You couldn't have your freedom until the end of the war. Well, thousands of African Americans did this. And leaving from New York in 1783 were ships where 3,000 formerly enslaved Black people were going up to Nova Scotia. Now, things were pretty tough for them up there, and a lot of them really felt that they hadn't gotten that freedom that they had been promised. But on the American side, George Washington, our general, he wanted use of enslaved Black men too in his Continental Army. Of course, Washington enslaved over 350 Black people himself. Mm-hmm. So he spoke to enslavers. And in New York, this was the promise. If you put your enslaved Black man in my Continental Army and he serves without problems for 3 years and survives, at the end of the war, he will get his freedom and the enslaver will get 500 acres of land. And so you see the push and pull.
Yeah.
We can't know if the Black men who served in the Continental Army for George Washington did so out of a belief in America's freedom promise, or whether they were forced to do it, and I'm sure many of them lost their lives. At least the British promise was something that a person could do of their own will. And I think that agency or lack of agency is an important point.
Let's talk about the way the book was actually put together, because I noticed that each chapter is kind of sectioned in a particular way. It begins with a piece of a primary document, usually I guess a diary entry or something, and then followed by your narrative of the history and everything. And then it also includes a glossary at the end of each page to explain some of the terms that were put in there. And then, of course, it ends with a QR code to link to even more resources. So when you thought about putting it together in that kind of way, who is your target audience and what were you thinking about when you decided to do that?
Kids are reading this book in the 4th and 5th grade when they first encounter the American Revolutionary War. But it might be a little challenging for those aged readers. I think the sweet spot is really 7th and 8th graders. And then we also have a lot of 11th graders who are reading this book as part of AP African American History.
Oh, nice.
But when we were putting this together, it was after we had written a broad-ranging book about Liss called Espionage and Enslavement in the Revolution. So that's the book that we published in 2021, the first book about Liss that just had every single part of the research in it. But it's far too dense for kids to read, unless they're just an extraordinary reader. But I feel that kids have to learn about Black history alongside American history, not separated from it. It shouldn't just be cordoned off to the month of February. So they need to learn these narratives from the very beginning of them learning about America. And so that was why it was so important to make an accessible book that was short chapters with lots of explanations of words, like sort of some fun activities in there having to do with the spying, and then those primary documents. Because when I wrote Espionage and Enslavement in the Revolution, we've got 30, 40 pages of footnotes for that book. But a kid can't handle a footnote. I mean, what does that mean to them? But when they can see with their eyes on a computer the original document with the transcription and then some questions around that document, now they're diving in. Now they're the detective. They get to have the fun of discovery. And I'm fully aware that kids all across America are going to point out things to me in these documents that could be their new insights.
Yeah, because I think that there was, there are a lot of references, like you said, it really goes among the gamut of the entire 13 colonies as far as the journey and just the not just because of the war, but because of the enslavement. So if you can, tell us a little bit about what has been termed as the Ellis Island of slavery. I guess that's Sullivan Island in South Carolina. What was the importance of that particular place in the whole scheme of slavery?
Well, I'd rather talk about what happened with Liss in South Carolina, right? Mm-hmm. So after the war, Liss did not want to evacuate to Canada. She was 3 months pregnant, and she thought that she would have a better life with her child if she stayed close to her family and in a place that she knew. So Robert Townsend bought her from her British enslaver, and then he didn't really want to own a slave, so he sold her to a widow that they both knew with Liss's agreement, so there was some agency there on her part. She had a baby boy named Harry, but then this widow remarried, and it was her new husband and fighting that went on about Liss that caused Liss to be sold south to Charleston. And her son, Harry, who was 2 years old at the time, was separated from her, and he was kept in Manhattan at the home of this man, Alexander Robertson. So now Liss is headed south on a ship called the Lucretia, and the captain of that ship had a side hustle, if you will. His side way of making money was to kidnap free Black people in New York, knock them unconscious, take them down to Charleston, South Carolina, and sell them in the slave markets there. So Liss, who was being sent as cargo, enslaved, may very well have been side by side in the hold of this ship with kidnapped free Black people. And so she finds herself at the biggest slave market in the Americas in Charleston. Ironically, you know what city was second in the colonies after Charleston? New York City.
Yep.
Yes. And many people from New York do not realize how much slavery took place in our city and that we were second only to Charleston. So in Charleston, she actually lived in this man's household, enslaved, and he lived outside of the walled city of Charleston. But as far as she knew, no one knew she was there. And how terrifying for her, how heartbreaking to be separated from her child. Actually, 2 years passed before Robert, up in Manhattan, found out what had happened to her, interrogated the man that had sent her down there, and started writing to people he knew were against slavery in Charleston to try to find her and figure out a way to get her back. Because unbelievably, the group that he had joined in New York had passed a law while Liss was down there prohibiting slaves from crossing over the New York state line.
Oh, wow.
So it actually became illegal for her to return while she was down there.
Yeah, because
but I believe they just smuggled her back. Robert had a ship called the Betsy. I can see her back in Oyster Bay. And I think it would have been pretty easy for them to actually just put her on his personal vessel and bring her right into Oyster Bay Harbor.
Wow. This is actually the makings of a really good movie, it sounds like. I mean, it's something that would be a great screenplay to put on the big screen and to be able to tell this story because it's full of drama, it's full of intrigue. It has all the elements of just making a great screenplay.
And luckily, these days, people really like a series.
Yes.
And that's what this needs to be. Any of you producers out there in the world, get in touch with me, because it needs at least 3 seasons. All of the side stories are important. We have fantastic examples of the experiences of Black enslaved people and free Black people, too, that are part of Liss's universe. And they're all brand new. They're all people that have never been spoken about and remembered. Let's
shift gears just a little bit. And because, you've done such a wonderful job in getting and digging through the history for Liss. Tell us, what are some of the other ways that you kind of bring the community to life for schools and for other people who just want to know more about the history of New York?
So I go to schools. I go and speak in front of classes of kids. In fact, believe it or not, this book is being taught in Florida right now. And I'm going to be headed down to Florida December 11th. And I'm going to talk to those kids down in Florida that are reading about Liss. I'm just so proud of that and so excited.
Maybe there is hope for Florida yet.
I'm telling you, it was the teacher who contacted me and her principal who made sure that we got through all those hoops that the state of Florida has set up now. All those barriers, we broke through them. But I also do an interesting walking tour of Lower Manhattan. I'm actually going to be doing that walking tour with some 11th graders at the end of this week and at the beginning of next week. So we go to a series of places, some well-known places like Francis Tavern and Federal Hall, Trinity Churchyard, and some obscure places. But every site has a link to Liss's story, the Revolutionary War part of the story. And then many of the stops, I will highlight a person of color who's also connected to that place and to Liss, so that each participant in the walking tour has an extra job. I want them to remember Liss, but I also want them to remember people like Timbo, a man named Colonel Ty, a Native American man named Jack, a little girl who's 9 who we don't even know her name. But I'm going to take them to the place where she was auctioned off. So we visit all these sites. It's about 2.5 hours long, and it's really intensive. I always warn participants that this is going to be as much of an emotional and an intellectual fatigue as it is the actual physical walking.
So remind our listeners, how can they get in touch with you to be able to either get the book, find out more information about Liss, or even more information about these walking tours?
We made it really easy. Our nonprofit is called Remember Liss. That's what we want you to do. We want you to remember Liss. So if you go to rememberliss.org, it's .org because we're a nonprofit, you will find ways to contact me, and you can email me, you can order books, you can order programs. But, it's always going to be me on the other end of the email. So don't be shy. Just send me an email and we'll start the conversation.
Well, we would certainly like to thank our guest today, Claire Bellerjeau, co-author, along with Tiffany Yecke Brooks, of the book Remember Liss, the remarkable true story of one woman's enslavement and freedom in New York, for coming on to our show today.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And I really hope that all of your listeners will be in touch. This is an important new founding figure, and she's from Long Island. So let's hear from your listeners.
And once again, my name is Kevin Boston Hill, and thank you all for listening to Instruction Discussion, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.